G-Raver began his career in 2007 in CZW, being really thrown right into the deep end, debuting for CZW. However, that match would only be the one match, and it would only be a couple years after that he would come back to CZW, but first he would go the next few years wrestling for various promotions across the independent scene in America. He won many titles and really established himself as being a deathmatch wrestler. But G-Raver never really got his big break, and it was the rise of GCW which was very beneficial to him, like it was very beneficial to other deathmatch wrestlers who are now getting a lot more regular bookings for a better production company like GCW, and probably getting paid better, I imagine, because carny deathmatch promoters are still very much out there. He made his first appearances for GCW in 2016, which would also be the same year he would return to CZW, which would signify that he's done pretty well between the time he initially debuted there and now, showing that he's done well to get back there. And 2016 to 2020 would also end up being the most busy years of his career, and easily the prime of his career. He won the GCW Tag Team Championship in July of 2021 with Jimmy Lloyd. He only held it for a week, but this was significant because it showed how G-Raver had done pretty alright for himself on the indie scene, all things considered. He never got his big break from a bigger company, but he pretty much reached a good height that you can reach for an independent wrestler, you know, a champion for GCW, who one of the higher indie companies. But as quick as he rose, the harder he fell. On the 2nd of March 2022, a woman accused G-Raver of physically assaulting her. And a couple months later, she would post some screenshots between her and G-Raver, showing some pretty damning screenshots and some pretty uncomfortable screenshots to read. In her initial statement, she also mentioned the following: "This man is dangerous, manipulative, and a drug addict. He's a danger to every woman he encounters and shouldn't be in this community anymore." And there's some undeniable weight to that statement, given that months later, G-Raver was busted by the cops for drug possession. In fact, here's a list of everything he was charged with: manufacture, delivery, or possession with an intent to manufacture or deliver, obviously for drugs, violation of hazard regulation, use/possession of drug paraphernalia, intentional possession of a controlled substance by a person not registered, possession of marijuana, small personal use, driving under the influence of alcohol or a controlled substance, failure to keep right, failure to use safety belt, driver and front seat occupant, and careless driving. It has now been over a year since G-Raver last wrestled, and I'd be surprised if we ever saw him in the ring again. Next up is Davey Richards, who goes down as one of the most accomplished indie wrestlers of all time, but his career came to a sudden halt in 2022 amidst domestic violence allegations. He debuted in wrestling in 2004, and within a couple of years he was already working for both Ring of Honor and PWG, who were easily the two most influential independent companies of the 2000s on opposite sides of the country, with Ring of Honor having their home in the East and PWG of course being a big hit in the Californian wrestling scene. Davey would come up through Ring of Honor, initially being known as the protege of Kenta, but it was a couple of years into his Ring of Honor run when he would form the American Wolves tag team alongside Eddie Edwards, and this is probably what he's most known for in his wrestling career, I would say, is his run with the Wolves. They're an uppercard act in Ring of Honor, and this team would lead to them both winning the Ring of Honor World Championship, with Davey Richards winning it from Eddie Edwards. And the Wolves would have many reunions, of course, including in TNA as well, where they were multi-time TNA World Tag Team Champions and one of the bigger teams in TNA history. Eventually in 2018, Davey Richards would step away from wrestling to take time for his studies, and by that point he was a multi-time TNA World Tag Team Champion, a former PWG World Champion. He won gold in New Japan, Ring of Honor, MLW. He had wrestled on pretty much every independent promotion and can go down as one of the biggest names in independent wrestling, and to have never signed for WWE. He would make his return back to wrestling full-time again around in 2022 when we start wrestling for MLW and Impact and various independent promotions, and it was good to see Davey back in action, until on March 17th, 2023, when promotions would start randomly saying that Davey Richards would no longer be making it to their shows or their bookings and not providing a reason why, with many wrestling journalists also vague tweeting about Davey Richards doing something, until it was then revealed that Davey Richards had been accused of domestic violence by his ex-wife, and this of course led to, like I said, many promotions distancing distancing themselves from Davey Richards, and it also led to Davey Richards announcing his sudden retirement as he issued a statement to PW Insider that reads, "Hello everyone, wow, what a couple of days. There are allegations of domestic violence against me. The allegations I adamantly deny, and if you look on the CaseNet and MO under my name, Wesley David Richards, you'll see there are no charges filed against me. However, I do understand the industry's stance on this matter. Everyone should feel safe at shows, and I do not want to be the person whom damages that." The pic being posted of my wife's eye is from training, and we regulatory train in martial arts as many of the students have got black eyes and such. Again, no charges were filed and I deny these allegations, but I must do what is right and not what I want, so I am cancelling myself. This great sport is far too wonderful for anyone, including myself, to tarnish it. I will wrap up my shows this weekend and I will be retiring from professional wrestling. Please continue to support Team Ambition and this sport. Davey. And yeah, Davey Richards did exactly that. He cancelled himself, hasn't been seen or heard from in professional wrestling since, and there's a very good chance he won't return, though I also wouldn't rule it out at the same time. Next up is a guy who tried to make himself a figurehead of independent wrestling only to leave behind a tarnished image. I am talking about David Starr. In February of 2012, David Starr would make his wrestling debut for World Extreme Wrestling in Germany. And it was his first match in a career that would see him wrestle all over the world in various independent promotions. David Starr, being from Philadelphia, would find himself wrestling on the American independent scene for various promotions such as CZW, Ring of Honor, GCW, and much, much more. Where I was first introduced to David Starr was throughout his time in Europe and the British wrestling scene. He won titles in Rev Pro, Progress, TNT. He was even the last ever Defiant Wrestling World Champion, the promotion formerly known as What Culture Pro Wrestling. And like I said, David Starr was really just wrestling everywhere. He was a big name in the American independent scenes, wrestled in pretty much every company there. The same with Europe, Britain. He wrestled all over the world, truly. Perhaps what he was most known for during his time as a wrestler, though, was his stance on unionization. David Starr was very vocally pro-union, and in 2019 he collaborated with Equity to form We the Independent, which was an organization which was formed to help raise funds for wrestlers to unionize. We the Independent is something that caused a bit of divide within the wrestling community because David Starr was very vocal about the fact he wanted to remain unsigned and remain on the independent scene and remain wrestling there. However, that is something that wouldn't last for much longer. On June 17, 2020, David Starr was accused of sexual abuse by a former girlfriend of his. After the allegation came out, many promotions would cut ties with David Starr, and not just wrestling promotions either. We the Independent would also sever ties with David Starr following the allegations. David Starr would deny the allegations, but it was these allegations against David Starr that would kick off and start the speaking out movement, a movement within the wrestling community that saw many wrestlers exposed for abuse. Since these allegations came out, David Starr has not been involved in wrestling. He has not wrestled a single match, and the social media accounts and the website for We the Independent have been abandoned. Next up is a man who goes down as one of the most degenerate wrestling promoters of all time. That is the promoter of IWA Mid-South, Ian Rotten. Ian Rotten debuted in 1990 and for the first couple years in his career would wrestle mainly around the Maryland and Texas territories, going by the name Johnny Lawler, storyline son of Jerry the King Lawler. He debuted for ECW in 1993 and his name was changed to what we know it as today of Ian Rotten. He was paired with Axel Rotten and they would go under the tag team name of The New Breed. Sorry, I'm literally recording it now and I've just realised it's The Bad Breed. The New Breed was like Elijah Burke's stable in WWE CW. He wrestled in ECW until 1995, mainly used as a tag wrestler, but towards the end of his ECW career was wrestling a few singles death matches and also began to make appearances for IWA Japan, foreshadowing. He wrestled for more indies and for BJW in Japan before 1996, and after being fired from ECW, Ian Rotten moved to Kentucky, and in the year of 1996, he would found IWA Mid-South, a hardcore car crash indie promotion that mainly used old ECW guys and would run various deathmatch events and matches. They ran around the Kentucky area until the year 2000 when IWA Mid-South moved to Indiana, and the next decade for IWA Mid-South, just some absolute craziness would go down. The year 2000 saw Dave Prazak make numerous appearances as a manager for IWA Mid-South, and he was instrumental in bringing in top indie talent for the company. Chris Hero, CM Punk, and his best friend Colt Cabana, just to name a few. It would be this year that Chris Hero and CM Punk had a 92-minute match, which is regarded as one of the greatest indie wrestling matches ever. And yeah, for the next decade, IWA Mid-South just did stuff like this. You know, pretty tame stuff. IWA Mid-South had really established themselves as a top indie promotion with a cult following. They were running regular events and getting good talent. But as you can guess, things are soon gonna go tits up. And in 2008, IWA Mid-South would become subject to a police investigation. At IWA Mid-South Queen of the Death Matches 2008, a match was set to take place between Mickey Knuckles and Mike Levi, and throughout the course of this match was just so uncomfortable, because Mickey was just delivering some stiff punches and weapon shots to Levi throughout the entire match, even shoot headbutting him to the point of there being a lump in her head. She won the match, and then afterwards, this happened.
So that was the whole match, but now get ready because this is the worst beatdown I've ever seen in wrestling history. It is very violent, so I'm giving you a warning. Tank and Devin Moore come out and decide they want to take some liberties on Mike for how he wasn't selling in the match. As if that wasn't enough, Ian comes out and starts hitting him with a fucking crutch.
So what you just saw there was Ian Rotten, wrestlers Devin Moore and Tank, as well as Ian Rotten's preteen son, who was now a wrestler known as JC Rotten, run out and shoot attack Mike Levi. Levi at the time was still a rookie, by the way. This incident prompted the Indiana police to investigate, and of course, major backlash. Ian Rotten claims that he told Levi up front that he was going to get a heavy beating and take an ass whooping. Maybe not leaving him in puddles of blood was what Levi expected, but nonetheless, no charges were filed. However, the next year, IWA Mid-South would announce that they would be ceasing operations following their Kings of the Crimson Mask show in August of 2009. And following the show, that's what would happen. It was the farewell show for IWA Mid-South. Until November of that year, when it was announced that IWA Mid-South wasn't closing down and would return with smaller budget shows. So basically, this is something that Ian Rotten did a lot. He would announce that a show would be the company's last so that it would sell out quick, and then he'd have the money to run more shows, and pretty much just had zero intention of that show actually being the last the entire time. Yeah, something he did frequently, and you're about to hear more about it. A year and a half later, after its return in March 2011, it was announced again that IWA Mid-South would be closing down. But yep, you guessed it, IWA Mid-South returned 3 months later, but this time, they had returned under new ownership. Ian Rotten was no longer promoting, which is seemingly a step in the right direction for IWA Mid-South, a good move for them. But guess what? IWA announced that they were closing down again, and then in July of 2013, Ian Rotten announced that IWA Mid-South was back, and that he was also back as the promoter of it all again. What was actually the point? And in case you're wondering, IWA have not changed. Going into the 2020s, they were heavily criticized for running wrestling shows in the height of the pandemic with fans in attendance and no social distancing. At the time, when not even AEW and WWE were at the point of having fans in attendance yet. Their world champion Jake Crist posted to Twitter just last year demanding that Ian Rotten pay him in a statement, and also posted a video of him burning his IWA belts that he currently holds. IWA's response to this, they cancelled all their upcoming events, leaving them on a hiatus yet again. Will they come back? Knowing their history, yeah, probably, but that's more or less the story of IWA Mid-South. Hopefully so far. But as for Ian Rotten, there's still more to discuss with this guy, because once again, this guy is just a degenerate. So without further ado, here's a list of more things that Ian Rotten did. He shot on other wrestlers. Yes, Mike Levi wasn't the only one. He did it to Peter B. Beautiful in 2001 in a match against him, and did the same to diehard Stephen Lee. He allegedly has hepatitis C, which is very worrying as he blades in pretty much every match he does, and bleeds profusely all over his opponents. Oh yeah, and speaking of shoots, remember that Mickey Knuckles girl from before who was part of the Mike Levi match? Well, she broke her leg on an IWA Mid-South show in a very gruesome moment. It's probably one of IWA Mid-South's most watched and most well-known moments, and it's also a moment that Rotten supposedly promised Knuckles he wouldn't release. And as you just heard me say, it's probably one of the most well-known IWA Mid-South clips of all time, so you know how that went. Generally, Rotten is just a carny, falsely advertising his shows, shooting on rookies, using untrained wrestlers, not paying wrestlers, booking himself to go over people and beat people up. He's just an overall scumbag. He got wrestlers banned from various venues, and finally, perhaps the worst of it all, is that Ian Rotten often worked with JC Bailey, who was a deathmatch wrestler who tragically passed away in 2010 due to a brain aneurysm caused by his concussion history. He had his problems with drugs, and allegedly, Ian Rotten was no help to this, and used to pay him in drugs to be on his shows. It's just pure scumbaggery, isn't it? Next up is one of the biggest creeps in independent wrestling history, that being Joey Ryan. Joey Ryan began wrestling across the Southern California scene in the year 2000. It was very early days for his career, and he would only wrestle for small indies in his first few years. He would find his footing though when he would help to co-found Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, a Southern Californian wrestling promotion which would go on to become the premier indie wrestling company in America. And while Joey would have fair success in PWG, being a former world champion, Battle of Los Angeles winner, and also having other stints in other larger wrestling companies such as Ring of Honor and TNA many years later, Joey Ryan's career was fairly stagnant after more than a decade of wrestling, and he still hadn't got his big break, and at this point in his career, it was maybe too late. So the next best thing Joey could really do is reinvent himself and revive his stagnant career on the independent scene, and it was then that Joey Ryan would undergo a major change in his character and becoming one of the most polarizing figures in all of wrestling. In 2015, Joey Ryan traveled to Japan to wrestle for DDT, a promotion that has a large focus on comedy wrestling and just being generally silly. During Joey's match, there was a moment where he used his private area to suplex and overpower his opponent. This moment would go viral and would obviously bring out a lot of people's opinions on what wrestling should be. And from this, sexualized moves and action would become a part of Joey Ryan's wrestling repertoire. He would do these moves to male wrestlers, women wrestlers, fans in attendance, retired legends of wrestling. Joey Ryan's new style of wrestling essentially saw him become one of the most polarizing figures in wrestling, with many people involved in wrestling seeing him as a joke, particularly Jim Cornette, whom Joey engaged in a very public feud with for many years, resulting in many long and jarring Twitter feuds between the two. Joey Ryan's wrestling style really did cause a huge divide in wrestling fans, with fans arguing that this is what wrestling shouldn't be, and other fans arguing that wrestling really can be anything. But in the end, the people who defended his wrestling style and gimmick would come to regret it, myself included. And once again, a quick content warning as we're about to discuss themes such as sexual abuse and assault. In June of 2020, Joey Ryan was named in the Speaking Out movement, a movement dedicated to exposing abusers, offenders, and all-round wrong-uns in the wrestling industry. And at least 17 women would speak out about Joey Ryan, accusing him of sexual assault and harassment. These claims by the women were backed up by other wrestlers such as Joey Janela and Ryan Nemeth, both whom have worked with him, with Ryan Nemeth having lived with the guy. Joey Ryan posted a lengthy statement on Twitter denying any wrongdoing, and would also post an over hour-long video to his YouTube channel, once again defending himself from every allegation. But by this point, his contract with Impact had been terminated, his promotion was shut down, and his wrestling career was rightfully put to a halt. And other than a failed return in March of 2021, Joey Ryan has not been involved in wrestling whatsoever, and he probably never will be. And next up and finally, who is quite possibly the most disgusting human still involved in wrestling today somehow, some way, is Chazin Rance. Chazin Rance began wrestling in 1999 across the Florida independent scene and would do so for many years, even making appearances for the Orlando-based TNA on episodes of Impact as a jobber in the early to mid 2000s. However, Rance never really made it far in his wrestling career. He never really got his big break, and he mainly just wrestled in the Florida scene. As I said before, he was an okay wrestler, but again, he never really had a big break, and would never really make any headlines. That was until 2010. When Chazin Rance was arrested in 2010, accused of having sexual relations with a teenager. In 2011, he was charged with lewd behavior as well as battery and sex with a 12 to 15-year-old, and in 2014, he was officially added to the sex offender registry. I cannot stress enough that he was charged and found guilty of this. So yeah, within 30 seconds of talking about Chazin Rance, that should be the end of this story, right? No. Because following his arrest, he would take a whole 7 months out of wrestling, according to Cage Match, and then just simply came back. And for some reason, people were just fine with it. He was actively wrestling during his court case, and looking at his Cage Match, he wasn't going longer than a month without wrestling. As quick as he was arrested, found guilty, and charged, he was even quicker at returning to wrestling and keeping on going like nothing had ever happened. And soon after, he would also open the Team Vision Dojo, a wrestling training school in Orlando, Florida. That's right, a wrestling training school being headed by a literal sex offender. Team Vision Dojo continues to accept minors to train at the school with Rance. Team Vision released the following statement to bodyslam.net when questioned on this. Hello. Chazin Rance was deemed guilty in the court of law in 2011 for actions that took place in 2008. During his time on probation, Chazin was in therapy, not allowed to interact with minors, and had to submit to drug testing. Chazin completed everything that was required by law and went back to training minors again, showing full knowledge of his past with parents. Chazin continues to be one of the best trainers in professional wrestling around, and there's no denying that. While the actions of the past look very bad, the future looks bright for all those that Chazin continues to help. Thank you for any concerns. Everyone at Team Vision Dojo is doing great and have many big projects continuing and others in the work. If you would like to contact Chazin regarding anything else or other false accusations that this website has promoted in the past that was debunked, feel free to contact him at chazin@gmail.com. Why Chazin was still allowed to continue to wrestle is absolutely beyond me, and I'm sure this video might elicit some sort of response from him, so that will be interesting to see if that does take place. But as I say, it is an absolute disgrace that this guy is still able to wrestle. Chazin Rance was also recently arrested just this year in April of 2025 for violating terms of his sex offender registry going back to that previous case. And yes, despite all this, he's still running a wrestling school.